The shrill alarm reverberated through the cramped cockpit of the Artemis. Captain Zara Vance's eyes snapped open as she jolted upright in the pilot's chair. Red warning lights flashed on the control panel. "Artemis," report Zara barked. The ship's AI replied in its calm, synthesized female voice. "Captain, sensors have detected an unidentified object approaching at high velocity. Estimated time to intercept 2 minutes." Zara's brow furrowed. She had plotted this course to avoid the major shipping lanes and pirate havens. What the hell could have found them out here in the backwater of the Centauri sector? "Bring weapons systems online and power up the thrusters," Zara ordered as she punched the general quarters alert. A deep klaxon blared through the ship. "And get me a visual on that bogey." The main display flickered to life, showing a grainy image of a sleek, angular craft, at least twice the size of the Artemis. Zara didn't recognize the configuration. Her finger hovered over the missile launch trigger. Suddenly, the intruder hailed them. "Attention, unidentified craft. This is the Centauri Peacekeeper cruiser Indomitable. Stand down your weapons and prepare to be boarded." Zara hesitated. Centauri Peacekeepers? Out here? The uniform and insignia on the face that appeared on her comm screen seemed to match, but something felt off. The Artemis wasn't carrying any contraband, but Zara knew the Peacekeeper's reputation for brutality and harassment. Stall for time, she thought. "Indomitable. This is Captain Zara Vance of the independent freighter Artemis," she transmitted. "Our weapons are defensive only. State the purpose of your intercept." "Captain Vance, we have reason to believe you are transporting a fugitive wanted for crimes against the Centauri government. Lower your shields and prepare to be boarded." "What fugitive?" Zara bluffed. "There's no one else aboard. It's just me and my crew." "You are in Centauri space and bound by our laws," the officer snapped. "Comply, or we will open fire." Damn it. She was cornered and outgunned, parsecs from any help. Gritting her teeth, Zara reached to power down the weapons. "Belay that." "Captain," a voice cracked from behind her. Zara spun around to see Kai, her young engineer, burst into the cockpit. His eyes were wild. "That's no Peacekeeper ship," Kai exclaimed. "I analyzed the energy signature. It's a Rynax Raider, using a holo disguise." Rynax. Ruthless marauders who preyed on defenseless ships at the edge of Centauri space. And the Artemis was carrying a secret cargo important enough for them to set a trap. Zara made a split-second decision. "Artemis, execute evasive pattern Delta 5. The ship lurched into a stomach-churning snap roll. Collision alarms blared as the Raiders' plasma cannons flashed past the view screen. "Get us out of here," Zara yelled as she wrenched the ship into a desperate dive. The inertial compensators whined in protest. Kai frantically worked the engineering console, coaxing every bit of speed from the straining thrusters. The Raider pursued them, pummeling their weakening aft shields with incessant fire. "Shields at 20%, Artemis reported. "We cannot sustain." A violent impact shook the ship as the shields gave out. Damage alerts shrieked from every panel. "Hull breach on deck 4. "Engine 2 is offline," Kai shouted over the cacophony. They were venting atmosphere, limping on one engine, with a deadly hunter closing in for the kill. There was only one desperate move left. "Kai, divert all power to the phase drive," Zara commanded as she punched in coordinates. "We're getting out of here." "But, Captain, we've never tested." "Do it." The ship groaned as Kai shunted every joule into the experimental phase drive. Zara held her breath, praying to gods she didn't believe in as she engaged the drive. The stars outside the view screen blurred into streaks of light. The ship hurtled into the swirling, uncharted abyss of phase space. Then everything went black. Awareness returned slowly, like a blurry picture resolving into focus. Zara groaned and spat blood from her split lip. Pain lanced through her head. The acrid smell of burnt insulation mingled with the coppery tang of blood. The cockpit was dark, lit only by the hellish strobe of red emergency lights. Debris was strewn everywhere. Zara reached out with a shaking hand and tapped the dead control panel. "Artemis," she croaked. No response. The ship's computer was offline. Zara tried to trigger the backup power. Still nothing. She slammed a fist on the panel in frustration, then immediately regretted it as pain ricocheted up her arm. Her head throbbed. "Kai," she called out weakly. Silence. Fear spiked through her heart. Where was he? Please, let him be alive. With effort, she unbuckled from the pilot's chair and staggered to her feet, favoring her left leg. She half stumbled, half crawled through the debris to the airlock connecting the cockpit to the rest of the ship. It took 3 tries with her shaking hands to rotate the manual override wheel and muscle the warp door open. The air on the other side was hazy, illuminated by the same baleful emergency lights. Zara spotted a motionless form crumpled against the opposite wall. Kai, she rushed to him, pain forgotten. A sheen of sweat coated Kai's ashen face. His breathing was shallow. Zara's heart seized as she saw the jagged piece of metal shrapnel protruding from his abdomen, just below his ribs. Blood slowly seeped from the wound, pooling on the deck. "Oh gods, Kai." "No," she whispered. Tears welled in her eyes. Kai's eyelids fluttered open. He looked up at Zara, pupils unfocused. Did we make it?" he asked weakly. Zara swallowed past the lump in her throat. "I don't know. Artemis is offline. But we're alive thanks to you." She squeezed his hand, trying to anchor him. "I need to find the medkit. You're going to be okay, you hear me?" Kai managed a feeble smile. Liar, his eyes rolled back in his head as he lost consciousness. No. Stay with me, Kai." Tears streamed down Zara's face. She felt for a pulse at his neck. It was there, but terrifyingly weak. He didn't have much time. Zara took a shuddering breath, trying to steady herself. She had to move fast. Find the emergency medkit. Stop the bleeding. Get the auxiliary power online to access the autosuture and tissue regenerator. Pray the stasis pod still worked to put Kai in suspended animation until they could get to a med bay. One impossible task at a time. Gritting her teeth against her own pain, Zara pushed to her feet and started hunting through the wreckage for the medkit. She refused to contemplate the alternative, because without Kai, she was utterly alone on a crippled ship, lost in the uncharted void of phasospace. An unknowable time later, Zara sat slumped against the bulkhead in the wreckage of her ship's medbay, staring at Kai's pale face behind the frosted transparent steel of the stasis pod. The pod's indicators pulsed a weak but steady green, the only splash of color in the twilight illuminated by the jury-rigged emergency lights. It had taken every bit of mechanical and electrical know-how Zara possessed, but she managed to cobble together enough power to run the stasis field and the pod's support systems. Now the only thing keeping Kai from slipping away was the pod's quantum stasis field, freezing him between one moment and the next. But the pod was never meant for long-term use. It bought time, nothing more. Time. That's what it came down to, Zara thought wearily. Because for all she knew, centuries could be passing in the outside universe with every minute they spent in phasospace. Even if she could get the engines back online and generate another phase transition, they could pop back into real space to find everyone, and everything they'd ever known had crumbled to dust eons ago. The ship's computer was still offline, so she couldn't even access the star charts to estimate their position. For all intents and purposes, they were adrift in an infinite sea without a beacon. Zara tried to hold on to hope. For Kai's sake, if not her own. He had to pull through this. She owed him that much. It was her decisions, her mistakes that led them into this mess. The bitter irony, she'd taken this smuggling run with the dream of earning enough credits to finally cut ties with the cartels and start an honest life. Instead, it was looking like a death sentence, or a one-way trip into oblivion. No, she couldn't afford to think like that. Zara dragged a grimy hand across her forehead and assessed her situation with the captain's cool pragmatism. Engines offline. Comms offline. Life support on emergency backup power. Food and water recycling offline. At least she still had gravity and breathable air, so that gave her maybe 3 days before she ran out of food and water rations. A week at most before CO2 buildup made the air toxic, even if she cut the O2 recirc to minimum. The numbers painted a grim picture, as unforgiving as the void outside her ship. But she had clawed her way up from an orphaned urchin on the streets of Zephyr's Rift to the captain's chair by never giving up. And she wasn't about to start now. Leads. What leads did she have? Zara racked her exhausted, aching brain. The ship that attacked them, the Rynax Raider in disguise. They knew about the Artemis secret cargo, which meant the Rynax had a source on the inside. If Zara could figure out who betrayed them, it might give a clue how to get a message out, or at least tell her whose throat to wring if she ever made it back. The shipping manifest was clean, so it had to be someone in the chain above her. Her direct contact was Talon, the well-dressed human who always smelled faintly of clove cigarettes. But Talon was a small fish. He got his orders from higher up. Zara knew it was risky to ask questions in her line of work. But right now, any scrap of information could make the difference between a miraculous rescue and a cold, lonely death. With a grunt of pain, she pushed off from the bulkhead and started limping towards Kai's quarters. If she could power up his personal terminal, separate from the ship's network, maybe she could slice into Talon's communiques, see if any names popped. Wham! The deck bucked under Zara's feet, slamming her into the wall. The tortured shriek of straining metal reverberated through the ship. What the hell? Heart pounding, Zara raced to the nearest viewport, expecting to see the swirling madness of phase space. Instead, a gray-white expanse of mottled stone filled the transparisteel portal, rushing up at her with terrifying speed. Mountains loomed in the distance under the glare of a too-bright sun. They'd been spit out of phase space, and they were plummeting towards the surface of an unknown planet, Artemis. Abort. Abort, Zara screamed reflexively. But the ship's mind was still offline, dead to her desperate plea. They were coming in ballistic. All Zara could do was watch the stony ground swell to fill her entire field of view as the roar outside built to a deafening thunder. She squeezed her eyes shut. This was it. I'm sorry, Kai, she thought. I'm so sorry. Impact. Oblivion wrapped Zara in its sweet embrace, a welcome respite from the pain, cold and darkness. She felt like she was sinking, drifting deeper into a bottomless well of inky shadow. It would be so easy to let go, to surrender to the fall and fade away into nothingness. But something stopped her. A face swam up from the depths of memory, teeth flashing in a boyish grin. Kai. He still needed her. She couldn't abandon him to this cold, lonely end. Zara clawed her way up from the pit, fighting the smothering weight of unconsciousness. It felt like swimming through tar, black and viscous. Pain pierced the merciful numbness, first a pinprick, then a nail driving into her skull. She almost slipped back under. No. With a monumental effort of will, she dragged herself the last few inches to the surface and opened her eyes. Blurry light stabbed into her retinas. Zara squinted against the painful glare, blinking slowly. Her head pounded like a Torcarian war drum, but her vision gradually resolved. She was pinned in the wreckage of her acceleration chair, its straps digging into her chest. Blood trickled into her left eye from a gash on her forehead. The cockpit canopy in front of her was a spiderwebbed ruin. The transparisteel shattered into 1,000 cracks. Beyond it, Zara stared in disbelief. An alien landscape stretched before her, bathed in the ruddy light of a swollen orange sun hanging low on the horizon. Towering mesas and jagged buttes jutted from an endless expanse of rusty sand, their layered strata painted in bands of ochre and umber. Wind-sculpted hoodoos cast long shadows across the desert floor, twisted into fantastical shapes. In the distance, a range of worn peaks marched to the edge of vision, their eroded slopes banded in siennas and maroons. It looked like a scene out of a fever dream or some mad painter's canvas, but the wind keening through the cracks in the canopy felt all too real, carrying the dry mineral scent of sun-baked stone. With a groan, Zara thumbed the release on her restraints. The straps retracted with a snap, and she nearly pitched forward onto the cracked canopy. Catching herself on the armrests, she took stock of her condition. Her head was one throbbing knot of pain, her face sticky with drying blood. Gingerly, she felt her torso, definitely some cracked ribs on the left side. Breathing hurt. Her legs seemed to work, though her right knee protested when she tried to put weight on it. She'd live. Now the hard part, getting out of this wreck. The ruin of the canopy was thoroughly wedged in its frame. She'd have to find another way out. Zara turned in the direction of the main hatch and felt her heart stutter. A jagged spear of metal alloy, as long as her arm had punched through the bulkhead behind her chair, impaling the headrest. She swallowed hard. If she hadn't slumped forward during the crash, it would have skewered her skull like a kebab. The realization of how close she'd come to death sent a chill racing down Zara's spine, despite the sweltering heat already building in the sealed cockpit. Suddenly, the confined space felt as cramped as a coffin. She had to get out. Now, Zara heaved herself out of the chair, biting back a yelp as her knee twinged. She hobbled to the hatch and tugged the manual release with all her strength. Nothing happened. The frame was warped. The door stuck fast. She braced a foot against the wall and heaved again, straining until her muscles quivered and her damaged ribs screamed. No good. Pinpricks of panic started to jab under her skin, her breath coming faster. No, damn it. She would not die trapped in this metal tomb. An idea struck her. She whirled and grabbed the metal spear, gritting her teeth as the jagged edges bit into her hands. This had nearly killed her. Now would be her ticket to freedom. Zara wedged the tip into the infinitesimal gap between the door and the buckled frame, then threw all her weight onto the other end. "Come on, you stubborn bastard," she growled through clenched teeth. "Move." For a few agonizing heartbeats, nothing happened. Then, with a protesting screech, the metal began to groan and shift. Zara pushed harder, ignoring the bite of the makeshift lever into her lacerated palms. Sweat ran into her eyes, making them sting. Her arms quivered with exertion. Just a little more. With a grating shriek, the hatch popped open a hand's breadth. Stale, scorched air wafted out, carrying the stench of fried electronics. Zara wedged her fingers into the gap and strained until it widened enough for her to squeeze through. She emerged into a scene of utter devastation. It looked like a bomb had gone off inside the ship. Debris and jagged wreckage lay strewn across the buckled deck, dimly illuminated by the anemic glow of the emergency lighting strips. Wires dangled from the ceiling like torn sinews. A thin haze of smoke hung in the air. But Zara only had eyes for one thing: the battered stasis pod against the far bulkhead, still pulsing with an emerald glow. Kai, she limped across the treacherous deck, nearly tripping in her haste. The pod seemed intact, thank the stars. The medical monitors still showed the steady, slow sine waves of deep stasis. Zara pressed trembling fingers against the cool surface of the pod, as close as she could come to touching Kai. "Hang on," she whispered. "I'll get us out of this, I swear." But even as she made that reckless promise, Zara's rational mind was tallying the astronomical odds stacked against them. They'd been spat out of phases space like a cherry pit, crash landing on an unknown world parsecs away from any inhabitable system. The ship was a mangled ruin, its engines and comms utterly slagged. No way to call for help, even if anyone was listening. And she was injured, alone, with no expertise in surviving hostile environments beyond the tall-tale spacer swapped over boil and whiskey. Her breath hitched in her chest, panic nibbling at the edges of her composure. No, she couldn't afford to fall apart, not now. Zara closed her eyes and took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to center herself like Kai had taught her. Assess, prioritize, act, one thing at a time. First priority, shelter. The ship's hull was badly compromised, and there was no telling what temperature extremes or deadly weather this planet could throw at them. She needed to find a defensible position. Zara limped to the twisted remains of the cargo bay, hunting for the survival gear. She upended a locker and nearly wept with relief when she found an intact survival kit. A little more rummaging uncovered a battered but functional Enviro suit and breathing apparatus. It would have to do. She stuffed the survival gear into a drop bag, then paused. Her eye fell on a long, sleek black case tucked in the corner, her souvenir M95 plasma rifle, memento of a training op with Centauri Special Forces a lifetime ago. She never thought she'd need it again. But if this world had hostile fauna, Zara cracked open the case. The deadly black weapon within was still nestled in its form-fitting foam cradle, its oiled surfaces gleaming. She hauled it out, muscle memory taking over as she checked the charge and cycled the action. The weapon hummed to lethal life. She swallowed hard. The part of her that had worked so hard to escape the violence of her past rebelled at picking up a gun again. But the rest of her coldly knew that squeamishness was a luxury she could no longer afford. Not if she wanted Kai and herself to survive. Zara Mag locked the rifle to her combat harness, then slung the drop bag over her shoulders with a grunt. Every bruise and strained muscle protested the weight, but she gritted her teeth and pushed through the pain. Time to face her new reality. She just prayed it wasn't a short one. The first thing that hit Zara as she cycled the cargo ramp was the heat. It was like opening an oven door, a physical wall of blistering air that took her breath away. Even through the Enviro suit's thermal shielding, she could feel it beating against her face, oppressive and smothering. The next thing she noticed was the color of the sky, not the cool blue of old Earth. but a washed-out turquoise that shaded to greenish yellow at the horizon. The swollen orange sun hung huge and heavy above the ragged mountains, its ruddy light painting long blue shadows across the cracked earth. Zara stared at that alien sun, suddenly feeling every parsec that separated her from anything familiar. She'd dreamed of setting foot on uncharted worlds, but not like this. Never like this. She shook herself mentally. Wool gathering wouldn't keep them alive. She had to stay focused on the things she could control. Zara made a slow circuit of the ship, assessing the damage. The Artemis lay half buried in a mound of rubble at the base of a towering mesa, its hull ploughed and buckled from the force of impact. One engine nacelle had been nearly sheared off and was leaking coolant from a spiderweb of cracks. The other was a blackened ruin. Char marks scored the crumpled fuselage, and several jagged gaps in the hull vented wisps of smoke. But for all the violence of their arrival, the ship was more or less in one piece. Whether any of it was salvageable would have to wait. For now, the stripped-down bulk of the Artemis could still provide some meager shelter from the killing heat. Zara unslung her rifle and climbed a nearby hill of scree to get a better vantage. In every direction, hectares of barren badlands stretched out in a tortured maze of gulches, arroyos and jutting stone pillars. Wind-carved buttes loomed in the distance, casting long, craggy shadows. Nothing moved in that petrified wasteland. No signs of life, not even a wisp of vegetation. The utter desolation pressed in on Zara, more stifling than the heat. Were they the only living things on this entire world? Then a glint caught her eye from the base of a nearby cliff, a flickering glimmer, like light reflecting off metal. Zara froze, then raised her rifle scope to her eye, dialing in the magnification. The glint resolved into an angular shape half hidden in the shadow of an overhanging rock formation. Zara felt her mouth go dry. It was an artificial structure. A bunker or prefab shelter of some kind, its surface pitted and sandblasted but unmistakably machined. And there, next to the airlock, Zara's finger tightened on the rifle's trigger. A cold tingle raced up her spine. There was a body. A humanoid figure in a vacuum suit, lying face down and half buried in the red sand, perfectly, unnaturally still. Someone else had come to this hellish planet and met a terrible end, alone and unmourned under an alien sun. Zara lowered her rifle with hands that shook slightly. What the hell had she just stumbled into? Was this some top-secret Centauri outpost? A smuggler hideout? She forced herself to think rationally. Wherever that structure had come from, it was her best shot at keeping Kai and herself alive. Shelter, possibly supplies, even a generator or comms array, if she was extremely lucky. She had to investigate. But every instinct screamed at her to stay with the ship, not to abandon Kai alone and helpless. Zara warred with herself for a long moment, indecision sawing at her nerves. No choice. She had to risk it. Every minute on the surface drained their chances. Hating herself, Zara forced her feet to carry her down the scree slope, away from the Artemis. "I'll be back," she promised Kai under her breath. "If it's the last thing I do, I'll be back for you." Then, steeling herself, Zara set out across the deadly crimson desert towards the distant bunker, towards answers, and towards a confrontation with this hostile world that had already claimed one life, and hungrily awaited the chance to claim two more. The lurid orange sun beat down like a hammer as Zara made her way across the barren expanse. Even through the Envirosuit's sophisticated thermal dampening, she could feel the searing heat radiating up through her boots, making the soles of her feet tingle uncomfortably. Sweat ran into her eyes, the salt stinging the cuts on her face. Her injured knee sent a bolt of pain shooting up her leg with every labored step through the loose scree. The plasma rifle seemed to grow heavier with each passing minute, dragging at her shoulders. But still Zara pushed onwards, keeping the angular silhouette of the bunker firmly in her sights. It was her lodestone, her only hope in this hellscape. She poured every ounce of determination into putting one foot in front of the other. As she drew closer, details began to emerge. The bunker was a squat, ugly thing, all brutalist angles and unadorned ferrocrete. Its carapace was pitted and abraded by the relentless scouring of wind-blown sand. A few pieces of unidentifiable equipment lay strewn haphazardly around the perimeter, half buried in rusty drifts. It was like the detritus left behind after a catastrophe, picked over by scavengers and left for the dunes to reclaim. But it was the figure by the airlock that kept drawing back Zara's spooked gaze like a magnet. That motionless vacuum-suited form took on more disturbing details as the distance closed the awkward, loose-jointed sprawl of the limbs. The sand banked up around the body like a shroud. Zara tried not to let her imagination paint the skull's face beneath that sand-scoured helmet. My face. Kai's face. She shook her head sharply, banishing the ghoulish thought. Focus. Survive now. Wrestle with existential dread later. A few meters away from the airlock, Zara slowed her punishing pace. Her hand tightened on the rifle's grip as she approached, ready to snap it up at the first sign of movement. But the only motion was the flutter of sand grains in the arid wind. Up close, she could finally make out more details of the corpse. The body was partly submerged in grainy crimson silt, but the suit appeared to be of human make, similar in style to the Centauri fleet's standard EVA gear. The helmet was opaque, hiding the face within. A sense of unease prickled Zara's nape. The seals on the suit looked uncompromised, so how had this poor bastard died if not from exposure? Cautiously, she used the tip of her rifle to shift some of the sand away from the helmet. She steeled herself to look into the face of horror. But the helmet was empty, the suit's interior filled only with fine powder. No mummified flesh, no leering skull, just a hollow carapace, like a discarded insect shell. A chill raced over Zara's skin, despite the intense heat. What the hell? Where was the body? She cast her gaze over the fine ruddy sand eddying across the suit's empty limbs. No drag marks, no signs of violence. It was as if the occupant had simply sublimated away, leaving only their neatly arranged vacated shell. The wrongness of it raised the small hairs on Zara's nape. She backed away a couple steps, pulse thudding in her ears. Her grip tightened on the rifle stock until her knuckles went white. She had to get inside. Had to. The airlock control panel was half buried in the sand next to the mysterious husk. With rising trepidation, Zara knelt and brushed the sand away, expecting the worst. To her surprise, the panel looked intact, its lights blinking dimly in standby mode. Hesitantly, Zara reached out and pressed the activation stud. The button threw a satisfying chunk under her gloved fingertip, but for an eternal heartbeat nothing happened. Then, with a low groan that made her start, the airlock began to cycle. Ancient hydraulics whined in protest as they battled entropy, sand raining down in rusty rivulets. The heavy outer door shuddered, then slowly ground open just wide enough to admit one person. Beyond the door was only Stygian darkness, black and fathomless. The cool draft wafting from that abyss was shockingly cold compared to the kiln-like heat of the surface. That darkness exerted an almost gravitational pull on Zara's exhausted body, promising shelter from the deadly sun, promising answers. But it was also the unknown, a lightless map edge where horrors could lurk. The devil you don't know. Zara took one more look over her shoulder at the ship containing Kai's helpless form. Then, with a deep breath, she crossed the bunker's threshold into the hungry dark. The airlock cycled with a protesting shriek of unoiled hinges, making Zara wince. The sound was shockingly loud in the oppressive hush that enveloped the bunker. It felt wrong to disturb that sepulchral silence, like shouting in a tomb. The moment Zara stepped into the airlock, the desert heat gave way to a musty, heavy chill that she felt even through her envirosuit. The darkness was an almost physical presence, so absolute it felt like a smothering weight. Zara fumbled for her suit light with one hand, the other keeping a white knuckle grip on her plasma rifle. A flick of the switch threw a wan puddle of blue-white light across the cramped chamber's bare metal walls. Nothing moved in the feeble glow, except for dust motes dancing lazily in the thin, ancient air. But even so, Zara's flesh crawled with the unshakable sense that unseen eyes were fastened on her from the shadows. Hunger in the dark. She shook off the morbid fancy with an effort. The fear was just a product of her exhaustion and the day's trauma. There was nothing here but the abandoned works of human hands, and those works might hold the key to survival. The inner airlock door was badly corroded around the edges, flecks of rust drifting down onto Zara's suit as she examined the manual release lever. The mechanism looked frozen with disuse, but she couldn't risk using her plasma torch and igniting whatever atmosphere might be trapped inside. Clamping down on the rifle with one arm, Zara grabbed the release lever and threw her weight behind it. The mechanism resisted for a heart-stopping moment, then gave way with a grating screech. The inner door groaned open arthritically, exhaling a gust of dry, dead air into Zara's faceplate. A fog of dust billowed out around her feet, stirred by the movement. Zara wrinkled her nose at the stale taste that seeped through her suit's filters. The bunker carried the unsettling bouquet of untouched stillness, like a sarcophagus cracked open after eons. Zara stepped cautiously over the knee-high lip of the airlock into the bunker proper, the crunch of her boots on ancient grit sounding sacrilegious in the breathless hush. Her searchlight played over a low-ceilinged space that might once have served as a ready room or staging area, judging by the lockers and equipment racks bolted haphazardly along the walls. The racks were empty, the lockers hanging open at odd angles. A thick carpet of rusty sand covered the decking, rippled into miniature dunes by the movement of air from the cycling airlock. Zara's skin prickled at the sight of several sets of half-melted boot prints pressed into the grit, leading away into the dark maw of the inner corridor. She followed the ghostly tracks with a growing sense of unease. What could have prompted the bunker's occupants to venture into the deep desert, abandoning their shelter and gear in the process? The mystery nagged at her like a sore tooth as she moved deeper into the complex, one careful step at a time. The narrow corridor twisted and turned claustrophobically, lined on either side with pipes and conduits that vanished into the gloom overhead. Here and there, dark gaps branched off like puncture wounds, leading to side chambers and accessways. Zara kept her light and muzzle trained on each black portal as she passed, finger poised on the trigger. But each room proved to be as empty and lifeless as the last, thick with dust and the leavings of long abandonment. A dormitory with bunks in disarray, threadbare sheets strewn across the floor, a half-dismantled workshop, shelves bare save for a few scraps of unrecognizable machinery. What gear remained was in advanced decay, pitted with corrosion and mottled with strange fungal blooms that made Zara's flesh crawl. The air hung heavy with a musty, faintly organic scent that the cycling systems couldn't quite banish. As Zara ventured deeper, a gnawing realization began to crystallize in her exhausted brain. This place hadn't just been abandoned, it had been stripped methodically of anything useful, like field rations before a retreat. But why? What had the bunker's occupants been running from? And where were the bodies? That morbid thought lodged in Zara's mind as she reached the terminus of the main passageway. The corridor ended abruptly in an armored hatch, far heavier and more solidly constructed than any of the other doors she'd passed. Stenciled on its pitted surface in flaking red paint was a single ominous word: secure storage, authorized access only. Zara played her light over the heavy locking mechanism. To her surprise, the hatch wasn't dogged. It sat slightly ajar, a sliver of profound blackness visible beyond the warped lip. Every instinct screamed at her to leave this disturbing crypt, to get back to the Artemis and Kai. But the desperate need for answers, for some scrap of tech that might save their lives, overrode her fear. Swallowing hard, Zara wedged her fingers into the gap and heaved. The door resisted, then swung open with a groan of metal that set her teeth on edge. Stale air billowed out, carrying a complex bouquet of machine oil, ozone, and a cloying sweetness that triggered some primal disgust response in Zara's hindbrain. Breathing shallowly through her mouth, she stepped into the chamber beyond. The room was larger than she expected, a rough cube 5 meters to a side. Workbenches and processing equipment lined the walls, thick with dust and sprouting sickly black mold. But it was the thing occupying the center of the room that riveted Zara's horrified gaze. It was a tank of some kind, 2 meters long and 1 meter wide. A spiderweb of cables and hoses fed into its base from the surrounding workstations. The transparent sides were beaded with glistening condensation on the inside, obscuring the contents, but not obscuring them enough. Because floating in the cloudy, greenish fluid was an unmistakably human form. Zara's blood turned to ice water. The figure hung suspended in the viscous liquid like a specimen in a jar, limbs askew. Masses of dark, stringy matter drifted around it like a halo of seaweed. Where its face should have been was only a featureless ovoid, smooth and hairless. Fighting rising gorge, Zara inched closer. Her grip was slippery with sweat on the rifle, its muzzle wavering. The sickly sweet odor intensified, raising the small hairs on her nape. Details leapt out as her light played over the obscene tank. Glistening, ropey tubes plunging into the figure's torso and eye sockets, pulsing faintly. Strange, bluish-gray growths studding the body, some with the uncanny symmetry of implants. The waxen, dovey pallor of skin that had never known sunlight. Zara's horrified mind flailed, trying to categorize what she was seeing. An aborted experiment? Alien autopsy? Nothing in her experience could account for this macabre display. Her panicked speculation was abruptly cut off as the figure in the tank twitched. Zara cried out and stumbled backwards, the rifle snapping up to point dead center at the thing's smooth face. Adrenaline seared her veins as she backed towards the door on wobbly legs, never taking her eyes off the tank. The figure spasmed again, more strongly this time. Zara watched in transfixed revulsion as its limbs jerked in unnatural, puppet-like movements. Thick liquid roiled in the tank, dislodged bubbles racing upwards. The thing's head slowly lolled in Zara's direction, as if becoming aware of her presence. Zara had the sudden, vertiginous sensation that it was staring at her, even without eyes. Ancient machinery hummed to malevolent life behind the tanks and consoles, disturbed from decades of slumber. Lights stuttered on, bathing the room in a sepulchral green glow. The tempo of the thing's spasmodic thrashing increased, making the suspension fluid churn. Zara's nerve broke. Whirling, she lunged for the open door, just as a resounding crack split the air behind her. The sharp ozone stink of shattering glass seared her nasal passages. Viscous liquid gushed onto the floor in a small tsunami, dousing Zara's boots. Writhing, twitching sounds squished across the decking. Zara slammed into the corridor wall in her blind panic, bouncing off and careening wildly down the passageway. The roar of blood in her ears almost drowned out the wet, meaty sounds of movement pursuing her from the chamber. Her hands were slick inside her gloves, nearly losing grip on the rifle as she ran. Her breath came in ragged sobs. The pain in her knee was forgotten, subsumed by the animal instinct to flee, to escape. Zara burst into the ready room in a whirl of limbs ricocheting off a bank of lockers. She could feel the burn of inhuman eyes on her back like a physical touch, spurring her on. The airlock was a black mouth ahead, yawning open. Zara threw herself at it recklessly, not slowing. The outer door was still open, a slice of eye-searing brightness in the gloom. She plunged through into the blinding desert day, hitting the sand outside in an explosion of rust-colored grit. The searing heat pressed down on her like a physical weight after the clammy chill of the bunker. Zara scrambled to her feet and ran without looking back. She ran until her lungs screamed and her heart felt like it would burst in her chest. She ran until the squat dark block of the bunker merged into the rippling heat haze, just another strange rock formation in that barren waste. Only then did she allow herself to collapse to her knees in the sand, shaking uncontrollably. The rifle slipped from her nerveless fingers. Hot bile surged up Zara's throat. She fumbled her helmet off just in time to avoid drowning in her own vomit as her gorge rose. She retched until nothing was left, leaving her pale and quivering. What in God's name had she just witnessed? What forbidden experiments had been conducted in this desolate outpost far from the eyes of civilization? The implications made her head swim sickeningly. Zara knelt there for a small eternity, trying to master her heaving breath and galloping pulse. Overhead, the merciless sun crawled towards the ragged horizon, dyeing the sky bloody. With an effort of will, Zara pushed herself back to her feet, her gaze fixed on the dark smudge of the Artemis against the base of the boat, still tantalizingly visible in the distance. Kai was waiting for her. She couldn't leave him alone in this hellish place, not with the horrors she now knew it contained. They would escape together, or not at all. Zara scooped up her rifle with a hand she forced not to shake and set off at a determined limp back towards her crippled ship, back towards the slim hope of survival. And she did not look back towards the dark bunker. She knew with a marrow-deep certainty that something was now awake in that abyss, something old and unknowable and hungering. It would not remain in the depths forever. The fragile sanctuary of the Artemis beckoned, an island of light and life in the deadly waste. Zara quickened her pace, trying to erase the sinking sun, trying to outrace the horror she had unleashed through her desperate human need to survive and understand. But deep in her heart, she knew it was futile. This cursed planet had already claimed them, as surely as it had claimed the doomed souls of the bunker. It craved living heartbeats to fill its silent reaches, warm flesh for its abominations to corrupt, and it would not be denied. Not for long. Zara's return to the Artemis was a blur of exhaustion and nameless dread. The sun had sunk below the wind-carved monuments, casting long clawed shadows across the cracked earth. The temperature dropped with the same startling rapidity as night claimed the desert, turning the searing heat into bone-numbing cold. Her suit's thermal system struggled to compensate, already overtaxed by the day's exertions. Zara shivered inside her enclosed world, feeling the chill of the desert night leaching into her core. Or perhaps it was the chill of the horrifying discovery behind her, still lurking under rational thought like a vein of ice. The dark mass of the Artemis resolved out of the gloom, growing with agonizing slowness. Zara fixed her eyes on it, willing herself forward. Just a little further, keep putting one foot in front of the other. After an eternity, she was stumbling up the lowered cargo ramp, legs laden. Emergency lights still flickered half-heartedly in the converted hold, buzzing on the edge of hearing. Zara stopped for a moment with her hand on the hatch control, trying to quiet her galloping heart. She couldn't go to Kai like this, pale, wild-eyed, stinking of fear. She had to be strong for him, had to keep the horror at bay for both their sakes. With an act of will, Zara straightened her spine and squared her shoulders. She cycled the inner airlock and stepped into the Artemis dim hold. The familiar smells enveloped her like a balm, recycled air, warm polymers, the faint oily tang of the ship itself. The homey sense nearly brought tears to her eyes after the day's alien terrors. She made her way to the battered stasis pod on shaky legs that barely obeyed her commands. Kai floated in his synthetic coma, features slack and peaceful behind the frosted diamond glass. The status lights continued their reassuring dance, promising that he still lived, still dreamed. Zara rested her helmet against the pod's cool surface, as close as she could get to human contact. "I'm here," she whispered to a still form. The words tasted like ashes in her mouth. "I'm here." She didn't tell him about the bunker. Didn't unburden herself of the squirming secrets now gnawing at her guts. Let him keep his innocence for a little while longer. The horror would claim them soon enough. Instead, she told him about her plan. The last desperate gamble to save their lives, pitiful though the odds might be. It had crystallized in her mind during that long trek back, staring into the eye of the dying sun. The Artemis was dying, but it still had one last gift to give, one chance to punch a hole back into the void and escape the nightmare they had fallen into. The phase drive was a ruined tangle, but the sublights, with a little coaxing, they might have one last burn left in them. One chance to reach orbit and send a distress beacon screaming into the dark. The thought of rescue almost made Zara lightheaded, but they couldn't wait for help to come to them. This hellworld would kill them long before any saviors arrived, be it through the slow death of starvation, or a quicker one in the depths. No, they had to reach out and grasp their fragile thread of hope, and that meant moving Kai. Zara laid it out to his silent form. The pod had its own power supply. It could keep him alive, suspended between moments. If they could manhandle it into the ship's sole survival shuttle, eject before the burn. It was a plan with 1,000 ways to fail, 1,000 moments for the hand of fate to close around their throats and squeeze. But it was all they had. Zara voiced it to Kai like a prayer, willing him to hear her need. He was the clever one, the dauntless one. He could find the flaws, shore up the crumbling foundations of this castle in the air. Together, they would find a way. They had to. At last the words ran out, dying to embers in the Artemis tomb-like hush. Zara slumped against the pod, letting its chill surface leach the heat of desperation from her brow. "I'll be back," she whispered to the unresponsive Kai. "I promise." Then, on leaden legs, she pushed off towards the engine room to begin her work, to begin their one chance at salvation. But even as her hands moved over the ship's gutted vitals, splicing and rerouting with single-minded purpose, Zara couldn't shake the leaden feeling of hopelessness in her gut. Couldn't banish the image of that pale, twitching thing languishing in its shattered womb, awaiting the warm breath of new victims to spur its obscene birth into the waiting night. The Artemis damage ran deep. It would be hours of sweat and prayers before Zara knew if the sublights could be coaxed back from the brink for their last shining purpose. Hours for the fear to gnaw at her, for the cold certainty of the abomination's patient, eyeless gaze between her shoulder blades to grow. But she worked on anyway. As the night winds of a dead world keened through the dark, the only eulogy this place would ever grant them, because a fool's hope was still hope. And sometimes that was the only light the universe saw fit to leave bright, even as the hungry void closed in from all sides. Zara labored on, racing against dawn and the devils it would rouse to claim them at last. The sickly green light of the console display stabbed into Zara's exhausted eyes, painting everything in the cockpit in a nightmarish underwater hue. It was just another echo of the horrors below, oozing up from memory into the weary haze of the present. She blinked hard, trying to clear the fog. 10 hours. 10 hours of desperately struggling to resurrect the dying Artemis for one last swan song, one last purging fire. The work had left her fingers raw and nerves scraped to bloody ends, but it was done. The sublights purred on the edge of hearing unsteadily, haltingly, but alive. Every status light from the engineering deck to the cockpit glowed a beautiful, welcome amber instead of the sullen red of failure. The Artemis was ready to fly, but for who, that was the question flensing Zara's heart. It had become clear, after the first few hours of feverish triage, to move the pod would be to kill Kai. The system was just too fragile, the connections to the ship's stuttering heart too tenuous. Even disconnecting it to shunt power to the sublights had made those precious status lights flutter alarmingly, plunging Zara into a pit of stomach-churning terror. The pod had to stay put. Kai had to stay put, suspended precariously between life and oblivion. And Zara had to make a choice. Risk everything on a devil's bargain, staying behind with a doomed man on a world hungry for her soul, or reach for a slender chance at survival, lighting one last flare to draw rescue, leaving him behind in the dark. Alone. The sob that escaped Zara's sand-scoured throat was an ugly, wretched thing. She clenched her bloodied hands into fists, pressing them into her eye sockets until sparks swam in the blackness. She knew what Kai would say, if he was here. She could almost hear that gentle lilt, see the soft quirk of an eyebrow. Don't you dare, Zara. Don't you dare let both of us die in this place. One of us has to make it out. Kai believed in beating the odds. Always had, from the hard streets of Zephyr's Rift to the screaming void of the frontier. He had grabbed hope in both hands and refused to let go. And he believed in her. Zara took a long, shuddering breath, drawing resolve around herself like a tattered cloak. He was right, damn him. Damn his stubborn, self-sacrificing hide. One of them had to live, had to escape this place and spit in its eye from the vantage of the stars. And with every fiber of her being, Zara swore it would be her. She would make this sacrifice mean something. She would be the flare, the beacon lit against the night. She would carry Kai's stubborn spark out into the void and make the bastards who sent them here pay. And then she would come back, with an army at her back, if need be, and the devils in the dark would learn the meaning of fear. She was on her feet, stumbling towards the survival shuttle before the determination could desert her. The small craft squatted in the cargo hold like a humble messiah, ready to spirit her up into the heavens. Zara stood before Kai's stasis pod one final time, drinking in his still features through the condensation-beaded transparent steel. 1,000 words of love and loss and desperate promises welled up in her throat, choking her. But in the end, she let them die unspoken. He knew. He had always known. I will come back for you, she whispered instead. A sacred vow. I will tear this rock apart atom by atom if I have to. But I will come back. Wait for me. Then, before the tears could fall, she turned and marched into the survival shuttle with her head held high, the hatch sealed behind her with a hiss of finality. The tiny craft shuddered around Zara as the docking clamps disengaged. She felt the vibration of the Artemis' wounded hull as the sublights spooled up to full power, ready to immolate themselves in one last blazing push for freedom. The pinnacle of human engineering sacrificing itself for its master's deliverance. There was a poetry in that, Zara thought. She sank into the command couch, hands flying over the controls with the ease of long practice. Pre-flight checks scrolled across the displays in a blur of green. All systems nominal, all lights in the green. With a deep breath, Zara wrapped her fingers around the stick and throttle. One last flight. One last roll of the dice against an uncaring cosmos. She pictured Kai's face, holding it behind her eyes like a talisman against the dark. Then she punched the release. The shuttle leaped forward as the Artemis cargo bay yawned open, disgorging her into the searing blue of the alien sky. The planet's arid winds buffeted the tiny craft, trying to dash it back against the unforgiving stone. But Zara's hands were steady on the controls, her course true. The Artemis receded below her, a broken bird falling back towards its rest. Zara counted the seconds, teeth gritted against the growing G-forces as the shuttle clawed for altitude. Then, with a sudden absence of sound more felt than heard, The Artemis vanished in a bloom of white fire. The shuttle bucked in the shockwave, dancing like a leaf on the wind. But Zara held it steady, held it true. The flames receded, leaving only a blinding afterimage in her watering eyes. And then there was only the sky, fading from blue to star-flecked black as the thin atmosphere fell away. Zara sliced through the thermosphere like an avenging angel, chasing the daylight, chasing freedom. The shuttle shivered as it breached the outer reaches of the stratosphere. The planet's gravity well clutched at the tiny craft, trying to drag it back. But Zara pushed the throttle to the stops, feeling the engines scream in protest. Just a little further. With a final, shuddering push, the shuttle broke free of the planet's jealous grasp. The stars spun crazily, resolving into the familiar geometry of constellations half a galaxy away from home. Zara nearly wept at the sight. She was free. Free of the nightmare, free of the planet's hungry hold, free to bring the wrath of every god in the firmament down upon the heads of those responsible. Zara keyed in the sequence for the emergency beacon with trembling fingers. The comm array hummed to life, ready to sing its siren song out into the darkness. She paused for just a moment, one hand poised above the release. "I will come back," she breathed. A promise and a prayer. "Hold on, Kai, I will come back." Then she mashed the transmit key, and the distress beacon leapt out at the speed of light, screaming her defiance and coordinates to an uncaring universe. Zara sat back in the command chair, suddenly spent. There was nothing to do now but wait. Wait for rescue, wait for a miracle, wait for absolution, even as the specter of the dark planet receded in her rear cameras. But even as her eyelids fluttered closed in sheer exhaustion, Zara clung to one spark of light in the enveloping gloom. Hope. Slim and wavering but unquenchable. The hope of return, of setting right what had been torn asunder by the callous hands of fate. The hope of seeing Kai's eyes open once more, even as his stasis pod glimmered like a promise far below, cradled in a nest of horrors. She would come back for him. And the monsters in the shadows would learn to fear the wrath of one woman who dared to hope in the dark. Zara slept, and the stars streamed by in cold fire, bearing her into the uncertain future. The dark planet receded, until it was lost to all but memory, but it would not be forgotten. Zara's vengeance would be a long time coming. But when it arrived, the devils in the depths would have nowhere left to hide.